So this panel today is going to be talking about using and demonstrations of how satellite data can be used to help quantify emission sources and other aspects of how satellite can help us understanding all these spatial temporal variabilities. So I'm going to focus on ammonia, and I just want to acknowledge some of my team members, both within my group, Ray Wang, Shui Guo, Da Pan, and Christopher Beal, and our partners and stakeholders and collaborators, Fabian Pillow, and then John Walker, Melissa Pachowski, Jim Kelly, and Jesse Bash at the US EPA. So ammonia is a really important precursor species, as we saw in that video. It forms ammonium nitrate and ammonium sulfate. Of course, we know the precursors for ammonium nitrate and sulfate quite well with NOx and SOx emissions, and those have been measured by satellites that we'll hear from Brad, Barron, and others. But ammonia is much less mature of a measurement. So what's shown here is an oversampling of the IASI ammonia, and we've also done this with the CRIS, the Cross-Infrared Track Sounder, and they showed generally similar trends in the hotspot regions. But this shows an annual map of ammonia, and then we've linked it to in situ measurements, particularly Rocky Mountain National Park, and look at deposition with back trajectories coming from the agricultural regions. But what I want to show here is this is the annual map, and their hotspots, these white lines correspond to the 95th percentile of the ammonia column from IASI, and their hotspots in the eastern US, the hog farms down in North Carolina, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, the central US, and then many of the western valleys where there are agricultural, both croplands and animal husbandry. But one of the things satellites can tell us is ammonia is really hard to measure. In fact, there's a very developing network called the Ammonia Monitoring Network that I'll talk about shortly. But even with that Ammonia Monitoring Network, or AMON, only 5 sites are within 100 kilometers of these hotspot regions. So, and then if you look at, one of the concerns with ammonia or ammoniated aerosols, as well as the nitrate component, is nitrogen deposition sensitive ecosystems. So we've worked with our stakeholders to look at these high resolution maps that you can only get from satellite and show how they can help inform the future placement of ground-based site networks. And I think that was one of the things for me that's been really exciting about HAQAST is, this was shown on the left as a trade publication for air quality managers. It's from the Air and Waste Management Association, and working in a non-traditional publishing sense. I think before HAQAST, I probably wouldn't have given it much thought. In HAQAST, I can see the value and reaching out to stakeholders. So here's an animation of the high resolution from IASI showing, a monthly, in winter months, it's low, it blooms in the spring, and that kind of shifts over from the center of the Midwestern US over to the Western High Plains later on in the summer. So we've done these maps, and it really allows to show you that an average annual map really doesn't tell you that much for ammonia. You really have to understand these huge variations that you see in the different months. So as part of that, we've looked at, as part of our efforts, we've looked at doing a clustering analysis, and we can kind of look at regions that show similar patterns of ammonia throughout the season. So this blue area here shows that the ammonia peaks in May, and it's a very broad peak and gradually goes down. The rest of the year, we can compare it to the ammonia monitoring network, and we see a very similar pattern. So, it does show one of the issues with ammonia is, it's a relatively new measurement. How accurate is it? How well validated it is? We've done some of that work as part of our base funds in HAQAST, but in general, the standard response for most places is it's really good over hotspot areas. So ammonia really has the ability to constrain. But if we look at, for example, the AM3, the NOAA-GFDL model, which uses the massage inventory, doesn't matter where you are in the country, whether you're in the blue or orange, it's all the same pattern of the ammonia emission, a peak in May, and then a pretty sizable drop, particularly in some parts of the country, and then a double peak later in the fall, in September. And we can see, this shows the CMAQ, which uses the NEI using various bidirectional or no bidirectional implementations. And you can see that you can often pick out, like in this case, in the central one, you can almost pick out the state of Illinois because a lot of the data input into these emission inventories are coming from state level, county level demographic information, fertilizer sales. So you can see this shows the peak month of the ammonia from various model implementations from the NEI and using CMAQ. And you can see, you don't see the general trends that you do over with the satellite. So this is one way that satellite can really help constrain ammonia emissions. And then a new opportunity is, we just talked in the previous panel about can we see single day events? And we have been looking at this, and this shows an area of winter wheat in North Dakota in the month of May. And the red colors are fertilization. And it's not every day that we have the satellite measurements because we do have some, cloudiness, but this starts in early May. This covers this time period here. And you really can see two episodic cases where there's a huge bloom of ammonia over this winter wheat region. So right about now, and then it goes down, and then another plume here later on in the month. So you see these fertilizer blooms, and we, of course, in North Dakota, there aren't many PM 2.5 monitors, but there was one relatively close to us in Fargo, and we saw corresponding increases in PM 2.5 when these blooms are happening. So the ammonia satellite measurements, at least in areas of large sources where we seem to worry about them, ammonia has the biggest, emissions, you can start using single pixel, single day measurements. And finally, I just want to finish up. We also did some work with the Kilauea eruption. One thing I want to point about this, using satellites for volcanic SO2 emissions has been done before, but I want to really emphasize Hawaii is really well monitored. And as you can see down in the left panel, only 10 of the 24 surface stations actually measured throughout most of the eruption period, which is shown in gray. The ground-based measurements shown in the center panel from Kona, you can see that if you looked at this data in real time, you'd have no idea when this might end or what the trends were. But if you look at OMI and OMPS, you can see even at the, when we had the HAQAST meeting back in Madison at the time in July, there was already hints that the eruption was starting to slow down. And without looking at satellite data, the conventional wisdom at the time was this could, of course it could go on for months, but there was actually evidence, there was at least somewhat of a slowdown. Whether that was going to continue or not, you can't say. So we took that with the stilt trajectory model and aerosol losses and came up with a map of during the eruption period, the average SO2 and PM 2.5, and then just combining this with purple air data that we heard about, with the model, with the satellite, we can kind of see where the high levels of PM 2.5, which were actually quite high, and then you can see in circles are the purple air measurements on the same color scale, which agree really well with those monitoring stations that we have. So again, using this, Jason West talked about this, using the syntheses of data, you can get much more than any individual part. So with that, I will turn it over to Daniel.
Thank you, Mark. Okay, so our work really is focusing on the forecasting side, how to forecast emissions, how to bring the emission up to speed of what is going on, such as COVID-19. So this is really a group that is been working together with both inside GMU, with Pius Lee from NOAA, Greg Carmichael from University of Iowa, Devin Hens from Colorado, and Log Lamsell from NASA. But we have a lot of other collaborators through our core project, and we also participate as 7 tiger teams. I cannot list everybody's name here. So one thing that we really want to address here is how to update the emission in a more timely fashion. One example was when we start to run the forecast model, everything was come from NEI. So NEI is great. However, it took a long time to compile NEI, and then once the NEI is available, this is already several years old. So there's no way for us to use NEI to capture what is going on, especially during big socio-economic events such as Great Recession and the pandemic. So I will provide some example here. How do we use the NASA satellite data to update the emission for Great Recession and then also for a pandemic? So the basic idea here is we look at the OMI data, which is red on the left, and also look at the ground data, AQS, And we compare that to the trend of the emission data we use in the National Air Quality Forecast Capability Model, which is the National Weather Service operational model. You can see that for many years, from 2005 to 2011, there was no update of the emission because the forecasts tend to be very conservative to select the emission data they use to drive the model. The 2008 NEI switched to a different emission models that called MOVES to calculate the mobile source. And that actually completely changed the trend because based on what you are seeing from OMB and AQS, there's a decrease in trend in NOx emissions. However, the switch to MOVES actually increased NOx emission in the 2008 NEI by 50%. As a result, we could not use the updated NEI for forecasting. So until 2011, we have the projected emission, and we use that. However, that was only capture half of the changes. So we end up using satellite data and the ground data combined to come up with state-level adjustment factor, and then use this factor to drive the forecast. So here is one example of how we use this emission data simulation technique to address the impact of the Great Recession on the US air quality. So we derive the impact of the recession from two model simulations. One's using the business as usual. In this case, we're using the EPA emission projection from the cross-state air pollution rule. That will project the would-be emission level without a recession. And for the recession case, we are using the OMB and AQS data to derive the actual change from 2005 to 2011. Based on the simulation, you can see that the recession actually has reduced the ozone concentration in pretty much the entire eastern United States, and then also lots of places in the western United States. However, you are seeing an increase in downwind to Los Angeles. That's because of reduced titration. The place has been polluted so much, it's going to get worse before it's getting better after you reduce emission. In the central United States, you are seeing also a slight increase. That's because of increased emissions from oil and gas operations. I think right now everybody is talking about COVID-19. We also apply this approach to adjust the emission for the forecast model, try to quantify the impact of COVID-19. This is a nice work done by my colleague, Patrick Campbell. He's using the emission data that we provide to him to run the CMAQ model for two cases. One is business as usual, using the average trend from 2014 to 2019 to project it to 2020. And the other one is using the OMB and AQS observed changes. So we are seeing here that the COVID-19, this is only for March 15, when we have this large scale lockdown, and to April 15th, so that's the first month of the lockdown. We are seeing a large area of decrease of surface ozone, except in the northeastern United States, that we are seeing a widespread increase. That's because this area under pretty cool temperature is showing a bigger impact from the titration than from the local production, from the reduced emissions. So that's something still going on. Please pay attention to what Patrick is going to present in the future meetings. I think HU and maybe a CMAS meeting is going to present that. And Mark mentioned the Kilauea eruption. By the time when we receive a lot of requests, for the forecast team, for the HAQAST team to provide time-sensitive information to public health and emergency responses. But that time the forecast model did not count the impact, or it didn't include the emission of the Kilauea emissions. So we're using only SO2 data, thanks to help from ECAN and other colleagues in NASA. So we will derive the emissions from the Kilauea eruption and put it in the model. And now the forecast model are able to capture the plume from the volcano fog. So I want to switch gear about natural source emissions. So anthropogenic emissions are being a focus. However, with our air quality improve, we are going to see less and less emissions. But on the other side, natural source emissions actually are increasing pretty much across the Western United States, including dust and wildfires. We had some excellent sessions early on wildfires. And here we just want to quickly show a simulation that our group did as a part of Susan O'Neill's Tiger team, that we actually trying to put together all the emission sources that we can find and also consider plume rise and different meteorology drivers and see how well we can actually predict PM2.5 emissions from the wildfires, concentrations from the wildfires. Because of bandwidth, we were only able to study 4 emission products, and that's GBBX from NOAA, GFS from the European Center, FEAR from NASA, and FLAM-B from the Naval Research Lab. But we end up having 112 model simulations of the 2018 campfire in California. So that's a quick recap of what we found. We found that in a satellite-based fire emissions, that's a factor of 10 uncertainties. So which means like from one product you use to the other one you choose, we have a difference of 10 times. And we also see a factor of 1,000 in the predicted surface concentration of PM2.5. That's because of the combined impact of emission uncertainties, plus plume rise, plus the transfer model, and also meteorology drivers and other factors. So the best performance actually come from the ensemble mean, which is the -9 in the middle, in the lower figure. The red line is the observations. And then the blue lines are all different kind of individual ensemble members. And there's really a large range of uncertainty in the emissions and also our forecast. So I want to wrap up my talk with a few thoughts. We are going to see an increasing demand to use satellite observation to reduce emission uncertainties for several reasons. First, as I mentioned earlier, it's impossible for us to come up with all these emission inventories for anthropogenic sources, and that sometimes just do not give us all the information we want. For example, you want to study air quality of COVID-19, impact of COVID-19, you have to use something more current. And we are also going to see more and more natural source emissions, and for that you do not have an emission inventory to start with. So basically, satellites or other observation-based sources are the only way to go. There's no other way. We have seen some successful HAQAST stories. Like for example, in our co-project, we developed 4 emission data simulation packages for NO2, SO2, dust, and wildfires. One is already in the operation by the National Weather Service, and 2 are in the experimental test, which is in the final stage into operations. And next, we're going to hear the great stories by Brad Pierce and Barron Henderson about the other successful stories we're using satellite data to improve emissions. And last, I want to share a few thoughts on what is going to be needed for future satellite applications. I think for the anthropogenic part, we're going to need a better sensors, better product, because the environment is getting better, getting cleaner. As actually a satellite has to be sensitive enough to capture the smaller changes. And we are going to see more wildfires and dust, and you are going to see $1 billion disasters from wildfires. For example, a campfire cost more than $15 billion economic loss, and that HAQAST, of course, is going to receive a lot of requests to provide information during this kind of crisis. And we would like to have long-term, consistent satellite data for emission trend. So we look forward to see the work from Locke Lamsell and other people in the effort to develop such things. And finally, we needed to compare notes with other sources. I think this has been mentioned by other panelists as well. I will end here. Thanks, Mark.
So I'm going to follow up with a discussion of some of the work that we've been doing. And this is an outgrowth of a Tiger Team activity that we did during the first round of Tiger Team calls. And I'm going to look at the kind of NOx emission adjustment experiments that we've been doing during the 2018 LISTOS campaign. That's the Long Island Sound tropospheric ozone study. So in the first Tiger Team call, we were selected to work with our colleagues at the National Weather Service, EPA, CDC, and also the Lake Michigan Air Directors Consortium, or LADCO, to look at using OMI NO2 retrievals to constrain NOx emissions through data assimilation experiments. This gets back to Davin's discussion for the need to use other precursor measurements to constrain ozone predictions. What we found out from the study using OMI is that the OMI satellite, because of its fairly coarse resolution, did not provide particularly strong constraints on regional air quality emissions, at least at the 12-kilometer scale that we're running with CMAQ. However, TROP-OMI, which is much higher spatial resolution, is able to potentially provide better constraints for these regional air quality predictions. This loop that's going through here just shows OMI NO2 column, TROP-OMI NO2 column on July 16th, 2018, and comparing that with the VIIRS day-night band that's showing you where populated regions are. And you can see that with TROP-OMI, you get a much better resolved distribution of NO2. So at the time that we were presenting this work at HAQAST, we had outlined some future directions where we were funded by the NOAA NESDIS Office of Projects Planning and Analysis, which is sort of looking at future applications for the next phase of air quality forecasting at NOAA to use these TROP-OMI trace gas retrievals. And one of the key points or take-home messages, I think, from my experience is we can't just do a Tiger Team activity and throw it over the fence to our partners. We need to find ways of sustainably engaging our partners so that work can continue in the future. So what I'm going to report on here is some of this work that we had planned to go forward earlier. So these are results from the experiments. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. The key here is that when we use TROP-OMI data, NO2 measurements to constrain emission inventories within the National Weather Service CMAQ model, the same one that Daniel Tong was just talking about, we're able to show that we get about 20% reductions in NOx emissions compared to the 2018 emission inventory that was being used by the National Weather Service, and that these are significantly larger than what we were able to get with OMI, again, because of the higher spatial resolution. The procedure here, again, it is a chemical data assimilation approach, but it's an offline approach where we first get a Jacobian following the work of Lach-Lamsel et al., where we perturb the model emissions, look at the response to the column, and are able to derive a Jacobian or beta. We then use that in a data assimilation experiment to derive the change in the NO2 column. Applying that beta, we can get a change in emissions. And so we've demonstrated this now with both OMI and with TROP-OMI and get a much more significant response with TROP-OMI. So earlier discussions in the panels were talking about how NASA supports measurements to verify the results of a lot of the HAQAST work. I'm going to give an example here from during the LISTOS campaign. So again, this is the Long Island Sound Tropospheric Ozone Study that extended over a long period in 2018. One of the instruments that deployed was the Geostationary Coastal Air Pollution Events Airborne Simulator, or GCAS. Scott Jantz at NASA Goddard is the PI of that instrument, and Laura Judd at NASA Langley was responsible for doing the column retrievals from this aircraft, basically a simulator for the future Tempo satellite. So these are results from that. I'm just showing one particular day. This is the NO2 column that we get from GCAS on August 16th, 2018. You can see this plume that's going to the southeast away from the New York City. Here's the CMAQ control experiment. You can see that the NO2 column is significantly higher than GCAS. If we then look at the results where we've constrained the emissions using TROP-OMI data assimilation, you can see a significant reduction in the column. as observed or modeled compared to the measurements. It's still high, but it's a significant reduction. And we did that kind of statistic for all the GCAS flights. Another key part of this is what is the result in terms of an ozone response when we change these emissions. So here we're using unique measurements from the TollNet network of ozone lidars. And in particular, there was an ozone lidar that was in Westport, Connecticut, which is just inland from the coast off north of the Long Island Sound. Here we're looking at results on August 8th of 2018, which was a high ozone exceedance event in this particular area. The LIDAR was at Westport, Connecticut. These are the observations. The ozone time series is a function of GMT and altitude, where you can see significant ozone enhancements up above 100 parts per billion that begin about 20 Z and then extend aloft. This is the CMAQ control experiment. You can see that it doesn't capture the enhancements at all compared to the observations. When we use the constrained emissions based on the tropomi data simulation, you can see we now have a much more significant enhancement in better agreement with the ozone measurements, but you'll see that there's a shift in the time of this enhancement. And this is largely due to timing associated with the sea breeze transport that we're not able to capture in these 12-kilometer CMAQ simulations that we're conducting here. So again, an example of how NASA measurements that are supported through the atmospheric composition program can be used to verify the results that we're getting from these HAQAST applied science development. So to summarize, we've taken results from our original Tiger Team activity, which was assimilating OMI data and evaluating that during the 2017 Lake Michigan ozone study. And we've applied that to TROPOMI for the 2018 Long Island Sound tropospheric ozone study, and shown that we get very significant adjustments in NOx emissions using this offline approach for adjusting emission inventories. A key point here is that this was following the Tiger Team activity. NOAA recognized the importance of that preliminary work and invested in continuing this to exploit the tropomi measurements. And this was again in support of NOAA's objective for a weather-ready nation, in particular healthy people and communities due to improved air quality and water quality surfaces. We're actually continuing this work now with the NOAA Unified Forecasting System, which is the new global model, and we're focusing now again on a time during a joint NASA-NOAA field campaign, the FIRE-XAQ campaign in 2019. So again, this sustained support for the work that was initiated within HAQAST Tiger Team through NOAA is a key to trying to get these into operations within the NOAA community. And then I'll close. We've also worked with Barron Henderson at EPA and successfully transitioned the actual data assimilation capability to EPA, and he will speak on that in the next discussion.
Okay, thank you. And thanks for the nice setup, and it's really a privilege to be a part of these great projects. Stakeholder. So again, my name is Barron Henderson. I'm a physical scientist at the United States Environmental Protection Agency, and this year we're celebrating our 50th anniversary, so that's 50 years of science policy building toward what we are today and what we do today. So our organization includes a range of work from primary research to applied research to policy to enforcement and administration. So some of the panelists yesterday were talking about this difference between people's focus, whether it be their day job is application versus science, and what does it mean to keep up with what's going on in the satellite field given where you are. So again, I'm at an agency that has a range of people who are interested in applying satellite data with a range of expertise, from not being able to work with a satellite data file in its raw format to using them very directly. At the EPA, I in particular work as a large team to assess the impacts in the United States of local and global pollution. We want to understand the impacts of the global pollution in particular. When we do that, we're going to focus on the global emissions, but primarily the northern hemisphere. And then we'll look at the transport and fate of that in a model. So I'm a modeler and working through that lens, which is why this particular project is so interesting to me. We've been using satellite data products for a long time. So CMAQ, which is the primary model that's used at the EPA, uses total ozone columns as a part of its inputs to constrain the photolysis rates in it. We also use satellite-derived emission products like fires and biogenic emissions. And increasingly, we're using satellites in ways to evaluate our photochemical models. So, for example, the most recent ozone policy assessment used a hemispheric model that was evaluated with satellite ozone, nitrogen dioxide, and formaldehyde. And I want to highlight the formaldehyde as a point that was really influenced by HAQAST. As a part of the collaboration with Tracy Holloway's group, we were working on evaluation with formaldehyde, and that helped to build our capacity to use formaldehyde in that way. So, of course, once you're working with evaluating your models with satellite data, you might be looking at that in a qualitative manner. You might be looking at that as trends and spatial distributions, or you might be trying to use it in a very quantitative manner. And when you get to the quantitative manner, now you're really talking about data fusion, which assimilation is one type of data fusion that can be very useful to us. In particular, the HAQAST Tiger team that was looking at NO2 data assimilation was a huge step forward for the EPA in this arena. So in addition to the work that they did that was directly applied, as Brad mentioned, they transferred the framework that they used to do that work to us at the EPA. What that meant was, instead of starting from scratch for a data assimilation system on our work, what we had to do instead was to translate a lot of the work that they had done in a system that was more designed for the way things were done at NOAA into a system that we're using at the EPA. And there's a lot of technical details that go into that, and we're lucky to have a research fellow, James East, who has a poster at the showcase that shows some of the preliminary work that's coming out of that, and he really helped us to translate that. So James' work is showing application on the continental scale, but as Brad mentioned, what we're really looking to do is to translate this assimilation system to the hemispheric scale and apply it in our hemispheric model. At the hemispheric scale, what that's going to help us do is look at the long-range and natural contributions, long-range international and natural contributions to composition within the United States and across the hemisphere in general. So the EPA is collaborating with a bunch of different organizations globally to try to get the best emissions inventories. But as Daniel said, developing emission inventories is difficult, and there's large uncertainties in those. And when you use emission inventories, if you are selecting between a few, you can get very, very different answers. So the question then is, what do we do with that? And assimilation offers a nice path forward. We can take an emission inventory or multiple inventories, use assimilation on those products, and try to see which one is essentially having the smallest increment through assimilation, or which one compares best to the satellite products. When we do that, what we're really getting at is the state of the atmosphere. So what we're really getting directly is what should the new state of the atmosphere be. And then, as Brad mentioned, the framework that they're using uses a Jacobian to transfer the information of the state of the atmosphere along with emission sensitivities to see what the new emissions should be. And there's a lot of things that go into that are really important in terms of the way we interpret that data and the way we use that data. So the first step in assimilation is answering the question, I think, as Jason West put it earlier, as the what is versus how did it come to be, or why is it. So when we update the model using data assimilation, we're saying what is. And then we're using the Jacobian to answer the why is it. And there's a bunch of assumptions that go into that, including how good the model is at the transport, like Brad was saying in his previous presentation about whether or not you get the timing of the breeze with the 12-kilometer modeling and that sort of thing. So it's really important that we use the data assimilation, but then we also evaluate it using our expertise and identify how far we trust that direct quantitative assessment. And I bring that up really because what I want to highlight is this massive new capability that we're going to have, which there are limitations. Certainly, Brad mentioned OMI having a relatively coarse footprint compared to what will come in TROP-OMI, and that'll be a really nice advantage going forward. But there are still questions that need to be resolved, and so I'm just going to raise a couple of those as food for thought. So, as I mentioned with the timing of the CBs, for example, when do the model artifacts complicate the analysis of our assimilation or our direct interpretation of how the emissions should change? But we also have to ask questions like, how do assumptions in the retrieval affect those constraints? And what is the best way to transfer the Jacobian to the emissions? That is, oftentimes we'll assume a local sensitivity from the column is directly related to the emissions within it. But depending on the resolution of your grid cells and your modeling, that assumption can either be very good or very bad. And it also depends on where in a vertical column the analysis increment or the adjustment due to assimilation is. So we might want to know what the best way to do that analysis is, but we also might want to know what the most practical way is. How simply can we do it and still get a really good answer? And so there's a lot of different techniques that are in the field right now, and I think we're still answering the how complicated does it need to be, and how simple can it be, and how does that depend on the resolution you're working at, the question that you're trying to solve. So these are really important questions for an organization like my own, which is more applied. Of course, we have a long data record for OMI, but we have TROP-OMI coming online, and so we're going to want to know how TROP-OMI will change our capabilities, and how far can we interpret these adjustments. So when we do an assimilation, we're often relying on the underlying emission inventories for a proportionality assumption when we apply them to different sectors. How good is that, and how much farther can we go? Are there things that we can do to separate out the sectors using the satellite, which is observing the total, not the sector basis? And that may involve dynamic analyses, that may involve seasonal analyses, that may involve all sorts of things to help us disentangle the sectors. And I think all of those represent, challenges for us going forward on this, already great advance. So I'll leave it there.